Keith.
Could we have, please, 47779, page 2 on the screen? Mr. Hancock, this is what's called a reasonable worst-case scenario clinical alignment planning meeting. There are references to the Chief Medical Officer and also to Sir Patrick Vallance to reasonable worst-case scenario. You can see there, thank you very much, under the reasonable worst-case scenario, there's a reference to 50% proportion symptomatic. So that goes back to the point you made earlier about, well, regardless of our developing understanding, a wise and sensible approach is to apply it on apply a precautionary approach and just assume it's going to be a certain level. Could we just go back to the first page, please? Sir Patrick Vallance, JVT, Keith Willett, Jenny Harris, and some other individuals dialed in. Can you recall, it may be you can't, it's too long ago, but do you recall whether or not this meeting was brought to your attention?
I can't recall it specifically being brought to my attention. That isn't to say it wasn't, and it certainly would have informed the advice I was getting from many of those present.
A day before, according to your statement, on the 13th of February, Mr. Hancock, paragraph 191, we needn't put it up, you say that SAGE came to the view that China had failed to contain coronavirus. So in the context of this debate about the two scenarios, either they contain it or they don't and it becomes a worldwide pandemic, can you recall your reaction on being told on the 13th of February that China had failed to contain the virus?
No, I don't recall being told that as early as that.
But this is from your statement, paragraph 191.
I'll turn to it.
Could we have, please, the statement on the screen?
191.
It's paragraph 191. I'm afraid I don't have a page number, but perhaps somebody behind me can assist.
Yes.
If you've got the page number there, Mr. Hancock.
The page number is 45. It says on 30th of February, SAGE came to the view that China had failed to contain COVID-19. I don't recall when I was told that.
Right. My next question. That was a seminal moment. In the context of this debate, you were told there's a 50-50 scenario. It's contained or it's not. And if it's not, then subject to sustained community transmission, it's game over. Being told formally, the government machine was informed formally on the 13th of February that China had failed. Would you acknowledge that that was a vital moment?
It certainly should have been.
Yeah. Yes. On the 14th of February, the next day, 56138. Page 7. You were present at the cabinet, of course. Page 7, thank you. The government's chief medical officer said that if the virus became widespread, there were plans in place that could slow down its spread. So that would appear to be a reference to infection control as opposed to vaccination or antiviral or therapeutics and so on, Mr. Hancock.
Yes.
What did you understand that reference to plans in place to be? And I should say, obviously, I'm asking you about these minutes.
Yeah.
We have no way of knowing how accurate they reflected the course of the actual debate.
Well, I think we should expect them to be accurate in as much as they are summaries. But I don't specifically know what the CMO was referring to. Nevertheless, at this point, we were starting to consider the sorts of NPI-type measures that were then later worked on by SAGE ahead of its paper on the 26th.
Were you? can you specifically recall the DHSE working on MPIs on the 14th of February?
Discussing them at that point in the middle of February. That's my recollection. I don't know whether there's any paperwork, but I remember thinking we're in the health department and there's a load of work on all sorts of things not to do with us. The first papers on this that came to ministers came from the Cabinet Office.
Indeed, and they were, as you rightly say, I think it was the 24th, not the 26th of Sage, but they're debated at great length in Sage around the time period that you've indicated.
Yeah.
But just coming back to the position now, mid-February, and in the context of Sage having appreciated that China had failed to contain C-19, although there is a reference to plans in place in the context of infection control, the measures for infection control were not even debated at Sage until the 24th or 26th of February.
Yeah.
The action plan, which you commissioned on the 10th of February, wasn't
Yeah.
published on the 3rd of March.
Yeah.
And as far as we can tell, there were no plans for expressly, except everything you say about vaccines and antivirals and all the other great work being done by the DHSE, there was nothing on infection control.
It would be wrong to task the DHSC with policies outside of its remit.
I'm not asking you to take responsibility for it. I'm just saying you.
On the contrary, my recollection is that we did take responsibility for it. We did work that was out with our remit, and I think that it was Secretary of State Gove who said too much was asked of the DHSC. I think that's a reasonable presumption because it wasn't happening elsewhere.
What plans for infection control were in existence at this cabinet date, the 14th of February, Mr. Hancock?
The plans in place at this point were still based on the 2011 strategy as updated by the work that had been done on the contain, delay, mitigate strategy.
Doctrinally, the 2011 strategy was still maintaining its. It was still having an influence. What in practice, what in hard copy or email were the plans for infection control by the 14th of February?
So they would have been based, again, on that plan, but that plan was not focused on overall slowing the spread of the virus.
Yeah, thank you. As the Secretary of State for Health, you have to acknowledge, Mr. Hancock, that by the 14th of February, there were still no plans for infection control in existence. There was a 2011 strategy report. You had, to be fair to you, commissioned a battle plan, but nothing had been committed to paper, had it?
Well, the commission of an early work on that battle plan had, but if your point was enough going on, absolutely not. To the degree that there was something going on, there was clearly not enough. I can't speak to exactly what was there on the paper without you bringing it to my attention.
Well, I can't prove an absence, can I, Mr. Hancock? You understand the question. The question was about whether there were plans for infection control in existence. On page 6, to go back one page, the Prime Minister, in the context of the messaging so far, had said he believed it had struck the right balance between preparing the public for what might happen and not causing unnecessary alarm. Can you recall, from your attendance at the meeting, to what extent the Cabinet and the Prime Minister were still concerned about being accused of overreaction or of alarmism?
Yes, that was.
Which date? Sorry for your answer. Which date?
It's the same meeting, 14th of February.
Thank you.
Yes, that was a live consideration all the way through.
In summing up, on page 8, the Prime Minister noted that he was grateful to you and your department for your work, and in particular for getting the balance of communications right. There was potential for the virus to have a large impact on the United Kingdom's economy, and it was important to be ready for that. You don't appear to have said in terms to the Prime Minister and to your cabinet colleagues, containment has been lost. China has given up or has lost the fight to contain coronavirus 19. We have no practical measures for control, infection control. There is no test and trace system capable of dealing with the problem, and there are still no plans in existence for providing any kind of practical support in terms of countermeasures. Why did you not say those things?
That's not how I'd characterise the situation. The first thing is that I'm not confident that by this cabinet meeting I will have known that SAGE had concluded that containment was lost, and in fact I don't think that I was told that for a number of days after. As I said, I'm not exactly sure when I was told that, but this meeting was the morning after the minutes of SAGE coming to that conclusion. First thing. Secondly, at this point in the department and in PHE and the health service, we were working extremely hard to prepare for the pandemic. I'd commissioned the action plan and work was underway on that. We were attempting and pushing PHE to build the testing system and all of the other things that we were directly responsible for. As I say, we weren't directly responsible for NPIs, and that's the focus of your questioning.
Thank you. Can I just ask you to elaborate further on not being responsible for NPIs? Obviously, you are the Secretary of State for Health,
yeah.
But you're also a Cabinet Minister, and if you just allow me, please, Mr. Hancock, and subject to Cabinet collective responsibility, also, of course, a major player at the highest level of government. To what extent is it permissible for a Secretary of State to say, on behalf of a department, particularly the department which is concerned with health in a public health crisis, the national countermeasures were not strictly within our purview, that they're a matter for cross-government, when obviously a great deal of time is spent in cross-governmental meetings. You have thousands of calls, thousands of meetings, thousands of officials working round the clock between you all to get on top of this issue. Is that a sustainable position?
It is in as far as the point I made. And the point I'm making is that there was a huge amount of work going on these things, including in the department. The wider point I'm making is that there was a limit to what we in the department could do, what it was reasonable to do. We frequently strayed outside the limit of what a health department ought to or normally did. And so so you're asking me for essentially a paper trail around this. Of course, in the national meetings, I should have, it was my role to push for these sorts of measures. The detail of who wrote what the measures should be was not a matter for me. That's the distinction I'm trying to make.
So which department of government carried the primary responsibility for thinking about, drawing up and debating the application of countermeasures, infection control countermeasures?
Infection control in the population as a whole, as opposed to in hospitals and care homes.
National.
Cabinet Office.
Cabinet Office. Cobra on the 18th of February, 56227. Again, you chair this Cobra, Mr. Hancock. It's one of them, I think 5 or 6 Cobras at that time that you chaired. Sir Professor Chris Whitty on page 5, paragraph 2, provides an update on the global risk. Both escalation to a global pandemic and isolation of the majority of cases to China remained realistic possibilities. Now, mindful of what you said, that you don't know when you were told that SAGE had concluded that China had failed to contain coronavirus 19. This is now 4 days further on. Did anybody think, as far as you're able to tell, think to stop and say, well, if China has lost control, to what extent can we be assured that it is only still a realistic possibility that the majority of cases will be confined to it? There seems to be very little debate about this assumption.
This final sentence that you've brought up here is my recollection of what I was being advised at the time and what I thought at the time. So when I was struggling to answer the question of when I was told the conclusion from SAGE, this is closer to what I remember understanding at the time. Right. Yeah.
On the 18th,
and you have to remember, in terms of process, apologies, SAGE outcomes were reported to me by Professor Whitty.
Did you not read the minutes?
Later in the pandemic, I took the minutes directly, but at this early stage, I was given a readout from Professor Whitty.
Did anybody know that the Secretary of State for Health was not reading the minutes day in, day out from the sole Scientific Advisory Committee on Emergencies?
I don't know.
The evidence before this inquiry, Mr. Hancock, is that the minutes were deliberately consensus-driven and short. They were quite short.
Yeah.
To enable them to be read by Cabinet Office, DHSC, Civil Contingency Secretariat, Number 10, and so on. But they weren't read by you.
They certainly were when they were presented to me, and they were. And they came up and they were reported to me by the CMO, and this is my understanding of the situation at the time.
Can I press you, please, to help us with when you first regularly started being presented with and reading SAGE?
I asked for them at some point in February to be regularly put in my box, alongside being the formal process was not that. I mean, we can come on to this because I've got quite a lot of thoughts about how this interaction operated, and it's very, very important. With hindsight, I think I should have gone and listened directly to the debate in SAGE. I don't think that would have queered the pitch. But the process of SAGE was that SAGE was a committee that, remember, at this point did not have the sort of nationally known significance that it does now. It was a group of scientists who came together to make recommendations and bring the science to the CSO and the CMO.
Regardless of their public prominence, Mr. Hancock, the position is that SAGE was the sole body providing science on the characteristics of the virus, what it amounted to, what the threat was, what in theory could be done, and the minutes from that body, which were being produced on a tri-weekly basis, were not, you say, being put before the Secretary of State responsible for public health.
Not in the first instance until I asked for them, but also the premise of your question is not correct. They were not the sole and only body. They had subcommittees like SPIAM. There was NERVTAG, which reported formally into the department. And, of course, there was a much wider body of publicly debated scientific advice. So SAGE was an important body, but I think that it would be wrong to fetishise the existence of and the role of SAGE.
Was there another scientific body concerned with emergencies for the United Kingdom government?
Yes, NERVTAG, for instance, had significant
NERVTAG was a DHSC subcommittee which reported on new and emerging viral threats, an advisory group reporting to DHSC. What other scientific emergency body provided advice to the United Kingdom government?
As I said, NERVTAG did to me through JVT, he was my rapporteur on NERVTAG, and then SAGE, of course, had a number of subcommittees.
Right. On 18th of February, your witness statement records, paragraph 194, that you were told by Public Health England that the country's approach to tracing all contacts was unsustainable.
Yes.
Did you know that on the day or by the time that you chaired the COBRA on the 18th of February?
I don't know.
On page 7 of COBRA, of those minutes, paragraph 17, the Civil Contingency Secretariat said there was work to be done to create a clear plan of activity across the United Kingdom government from the moment of sustained transmission to its estimated peak, which was likely to be a period of 3 months. When you heard those words, did you understand that the director of the Civil Contingency Secretariat was referring to a clear plan of activity for infection control measures, i.e. to do with the subject matter of what came the 12th, 16th, 20th, 23rd March measures?
No.
What did you take that to be a reference to then?
The director of the Civil Contingency Secretariat was a strong supporter of the 2011 approach, if I can call it.
Mr. Hancock, please forgive me. She said there was work to be done to create a clear plan of activity. What did you understand as the chair of that committee that to be a reference to? Just what is it?
To the sort of work that was, for instance, highlighted in the Nimbus exercise. The activity proposed here is activity to prepare for a large-scale pandemic, essentially unmitigated.
But you yourself said Nimbus had no reference and made no reference to any countermeasures at all.
That's right.
So what was this a reference to then? If it was a reference,
it was a reference to all the other work that you would need if you didn't take any countermeasures. That was the view. That was the position of CCS, as represented and articulated, for instance, in the 28th of February note from CCS to the Prime Minister, which was all a note about how to manage the consequences of a pandemic, not how to stop it.
All right. To get our bearings, Mr. Hancock, there was half term between Friday the 14th of February and Monday the 24th of February, by and large. During that half term, Italy imposed a lockdown on 11 municipalities. Reports were prepared on the significance of the Diamond Princess coronavirus outbreak, and although you have given evidence to the effect that it may not have been drawn to your attention, NervTag happened to have reported during that time, the 21st of February, that 40% of virologically confirmed cases were asymptomatic. Can you assist the inquiry, please, with what, if any, work was done on countermeasures for infection control between the COBRA of the 18th of February, and I've just shown you the reference to the CCS, and the 28th of February, which was when a paper, as it happens, was prepared by them. Do you know whether any work was done other than in relation to that paper?
Yes, there was work. There was scientific work being done by SAGE on the consideration of NPIs. There was a note that was put together by SAGE, which is dated the 26th of February, that was considered at the 27th of February meeting by SAGE.
You referred to that earlier.
Yeah.
Do you know whether or not pen was put to paper in any way by government to set out even a broad outline of what practical infection control measures might be required to be implemented?
Yes, the department was drafting what became the action plan. Now, there's a genesis of that plan. We started, I commissioned a...
Can I, forgive me, I'm going to come to the plan in a moment.
Okay, but at this point it was being drafted, so yes.
Right. So the plan, which was published on the 3rd of March, was being
drafted.
Worked
and
on.
SAGE was doing scientific work, yeah.
But there was no draft anywhere being circulated amongst relevant bodies between COBRA on the 18th and the 28th of February when they reported setting out possible countermeasures.
The work was being done on the action plan. That was the work going on in the department. And there was work being done within the SAGE structure, which came to the 26th of February paper. And furthermore, there was work being done by lawyers on the legal framework needed.
The pandemic bill, the coronavirus bill became the Act, all that.
And the measures that were needed under the Public Health Act 1984 in order to have legal recourse for mandated quarantine.
Legislative proposals are not non-pharmaceutical interventions.
Yes, they are.
All right. Well,
as a matter of fact, they are. And it's very important that I correct you on that point, because if the inquiry comes to the wrong conclusion on that, it will be a mistake. Communications are very important non-pharmaceutical intervention. Legislation is a very important non-pharmaceutical intervention, because if you want to have, for instance, a stay-at-home measure, you can't have it in a mandatory sense without legislation. So I'm emphatic on that point, because you've made that mistake twice.
Mr. Keith, I think we're going round in circles. I think we were here this morning.
On the 28th of February, a view was expressed by the Prime Minister when this CCS report was debated, that the biggest damage may be done by overreaction.
Yes.
What was your response?
I don't recall being told that that was his view of the paper.
On the 28th of February, your statement records, however, that your belief that Number 10 was stopping the Prime Minister from saying publicly anything about the virus.
Yes. So the 27th of... Sorry.
And you knew that that was because there was a concern that it would be seen to be overreacting.
Yeah, the 28th of February was an important day in the response, and it was important in this way. I had a readout from the SAGE on the 27th, which both took the paper on NPIs that we've just been talking about and also discussed the 1% IFR figure. The 1% IFR figure is very important, because if you have a 1% fatality rate at an 80% of the population getting it, you end up with a reasonable worst-case scenario of just over 500,000 people dying. And I found that out on the evening of the 27th, if I recall correctly. On the 28th, I was still not being allowed to communicate in the way I'd want on this, not able to go on certain radio shows, including the Today programme, which is a very important part of the national debate. And I phoned up the Prime Minister, and I remember it very well, because he didn't take the call, and then he called me back, and I was in a classroom in a primary school in Suffolk, in Haverhill, in my constituency, and I had to say to the kids, I'm really sorry, the Prime Minister's calling, I've got to go. And it was quite a moment. I came out and I said, Prime Minister, you need to chair a COBRA, and we need to be able to communicate properly, including on all of the programmes, instead of having this political boycott. That led to, I wanted a COBRA that day, and I told him he should chair a COBRA immediately. In the end, we had the COBRA on the Monday, which I think was the 2nd of March. Over that weekend, I went out and communicated in public about all the things that we might have to do. We might have to close some schools. We might have to shut down whole cities. I don't rule anything out, I said. And that all flowed from this phone call on the morning of the 28th of February. And I regard that as the moment that the centre of government, led by the Prime Minister, really started to come into action. And if I may say so, with hindsight, Italy having locked down initially locally in Lombardy on the 21st of January, and then nationally locked down around also the 28th of February, if at that moment, having seen the SAGE assumptions, which they didn't properly fully adopt, but nevertheless, and you've heard from the scientists on that, if that at that moment we'd realised that it was definitely coming and the reasonable worst case scenario was as awful as it was, that is the moment that we should, with hindsight, have acted. And if we'd had the doctrine that I propose, which is as soon as you know you've got a lockdown, you lock down as soon as possible, then we would have got the lockdown done over that weekend, in on the 2nd of March, 3 weeks earlier than before. There's a doubling rate at this point, estimated every 3 to 4 days. We would have been 6 doublings ahead of where we were, which means that fewer than a tenth of the number of people would have died in the first wave. At the time, there was still enormous uncertainty. The number of cases was still very low. In fact, there were only 12 cases reported on the 1st of March. So you can understand why, and the costs of what I'm just proposing were known and huge. So I defend the actions that were taken by the government at the time, knowing what we did. But with hindsight, that's the moment we should have done it 3 weeks earlier, and it would have saved many, many lives.
Monday, the 2nd of March.
That is, with hindsight, having obviously thought about this and reflected on this a huge deal over the last few years, with hindsight, the moment we should have been able, first moment we realistically could have really cracked it was on the 2nd of March, 3 weeks earlier than we did.
Mr. Hancock, you have been heard loud and clear. At that meeting on Cobra, the 2nd of March, the Chief Medical Officer said that interventions to delay the spread of the virus must not be implemented too early.
Yes.
It is clear from Cobra minutes from the 4th of March, your witness statement, paragraph 236, to the effect that there was a real debate about whether the public might comply.
Yep.
Your witness statement at 269, which is that you were asked by people outside government why the government was not introducing restrictions sooner, and you responded by saying you'd received clinical advice to the effect the government, quote, should not go too soon. And you also refer to how your sense was that the wider world was moving faster than the official advice was being received. For how long did this notion that in terms of the application of countermeasures, the country should not go too early, which transmorphed itself into a debate on behavioural fatigue in due course, how long and to what extent do you assess that that debate slowed down the reaction so that we've found ourselves in a position which you've eloquently described, which is not going as early as you now, with hindsight, assess we should have done?
For 2 weeks, and you can trace it very clearly. If you take the 28th of February as the moment when it became clear that action was going to be needed, and the work was put together over that weekend, the Cobra on the 2nd in the end, the action plan finally published on the 3rd. As it happens, on the 1st, it was a Sunday, I spoke on the MAR programme, and when asked, will you lock down whole cities, I said, I can't rule it. We can't rule anything out. Incidentally, to show where society was up to and the broader debate, when I said you don't want to go too early, the response was, well, yes, we all know, we all think that. So this is not just a government thing. This is a whole of society question. And there was then, from that period, that weekend, the discussion was then when to go, not whether to go. So it switched from whether to go to when to go. And we held fire because we didn't know how long the public would put up with measures for, and that was the clear scientific advice. And on this, Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty were completely united. I don't recall any distinction between their views during this period. And then on the 13th of March, we effectively came to a different view. I've had the chance to check because you questioned the phone call I made to the Prime Minister. It was at 3:34 that afternoon. I've been at 3:24. I've been able to check my phone records, which have come to light since. Hold on.
No, Mr. Hancock. You know perfectly well that we have scoured every possible source for documents and material relevant to the issues in this inquiry. Are you saying that you have a record of a phone call which you've not disclosed to this inquiry?
No, there isn't. There's only a record that the phone call took place.
So you don't know what you said in that phone call?
I do.
All right. Proceed.
So that's on the 13th. Evening of the 13th, I send the email that we discussed earlier. On the 14th, we're in Downing Street, and we have a series of meetings, including some in the Cabinet Room and some in the smaller office. And then on the 15th, had the formal meeting at which we decided to take action.
Please come back to the issue, which is the issue I asked you about, which was the concern that going too early would limit effectiveness. The CMO, and we must be clear about this, of course there was a whole society anxiety, to use your phrase, whole society, concern about should we be contemplating the intolerable?
Yeah.
Should the country countenance these extraordinary, unprecedented measures?
With enormous costs.
With enormous costs. I've asked you about a notion which is expressly referred to in the COBRA meeting the 2nd of March, which was that interventions to delay the spread of the virus must not be implemented too early in order to ensure maximum effectiveness.
Yes.
So put aside the whole society anxiety.
Yes.
Your witness statement says you relayed to a particular former Prime Minister who asked you why weren't we going too early, that you had been told on clinical advice, that's your word, clinical advice, that we should not implement countermeasures yet.
Yes.
So what was the basis? Well, you've said it came from the CMO and the GCSA.
Yes.
This clinical notion.
Yes.
You're saying that lasted for 2 weeks?
Correct.
All right. And do you assess, therefore, that that was a major contributory feature to the government not acting earlier?
With hindsight, yes. At the time, it was entirely understandable.
All right. The action plan, and we can deal with this, please, briefly.
Yeah.
Because you've referred to it in a number of ways. The action plan was dated the 3rd of March. There it is. Thank you. Would you please just accept, for the purposes of speed, that it was a document prepared across the United Kingdom? We can see references to the DA's involvement there on the page. We know that it was commissioned by you, according to the evidence of Sir Christopher Wormold, on the 10th of February. You requested in an email to Kevin Dodds that the work be commenced. It was developed under the leadership, according to Sir Christopher Wormold, of the DHSC, and this was the document that was drafted from around about the 10th of February to the 3rd of March.
Yes.
Did the government, did the DHSC, did you or Sir Christopher Wormold ponder the wisdom of commissioning a report on the 10th of February that by the time it had done the rounds of government and been redrafted and re-edited and so on and so forth, was not published until the 3rd of March, by which time, as you've accepted, containment for all practical intents and purposes had been lost?
Well, I initially commissioned it as a health action plan. I wanted to set out in public what the department needed to do. Sometimes when you're trying to drive action in government, publishing something is one of the quickest ways of doing it, because once it's published, everybody falls behind it. And then you don't have any arguments about what the plan should be. And so publication is sometimes most important for the purposes of driving action within government. This has been criticised as being high level and more of a comms plan. More accurately, I would say, of course, it was about explaining to the public what might come next, and we did a huge amount of explaining off the back of it. But it was also about telling the department, and then in the end, it ended up as a cross-government document and a cross-UK document about what we might have to do.
You say, quite reasonably, that when you're trying to drive action in government, publishing something is one of the quickest ways of doing it.
Sometimes.
Quite. On this occasion, in the face of a fast-moving pandemic, it took 21 days from the commissioning to the publication. So it wasn't terribly quick.
Well, in the grand scheme of government documents, that's unbelievably fast. They normally take months. The civil service team who worked on this were absolutely brilliant inside the DHSC. It was then slowed down when it was sent for clearance, and I think there's been some discussion of that, and that was deeply frustrating. But it was very, very important to get out, to drive action internally, and also to start to explain to the public the sorts of absolutely extraordinary things that might have to happen. It was the first time we communicated to the public that we might have to shut schools, close down whole cities, ask people to isolate at home. These are huge, unprecedented interventions, and it was very important to start to communicate that to the public.
I've not suggested that there wasn't merit in the document. I've asked you about the delay in its publication.
I wish it had come out quicker.
At page 4, without going to it, the document claims that the United Kingdom is well prepared. At page 10, in the context of the overarching strategy, you'll recall, Mr. Hancock, contain, delay, mitigate. You, more than anybody, will remember those words, of course. The document significantly overpitched the reality. We weren't well prepared, and insofar as the strategy envisaged future loss of containment, and if control is lost, then we'll move to delay.
Well, when
it was
this
already over.
Absolutely, when this was commissioned, that was the clear strategy, and that strategy remained formally in place until the 12th, 13th, 14th, exactly.
12th of March, indeed, containment was officially departed from. Can I ask you about...
Just forgive me interrupting. I've just had another look at the action plan. There's quite a lot of information in there. What I can't find is too much of the action points.
No, there's not nearly as much as I wished that there had been. They are in there. They're buried at the end. And it was enough to allow the media to then report it as we wished, which was, these are the sorts of things that might have to happen. So closure of schools, for instance, they're mentioned, but they're not up front nearly as much as they should have been.
You would say...
I'd say better than nothing.
I was going to say, you would say better than nothing, and I suspect you'd also say, remember that at the time this was commissioned, the DHSC expressly understood, and you've said yourself, that it had its doctrinal genesis in the flu plan.
In 2011.
And that's why there was a reference to closing schools, which was very much part of a flu plan, but no reference to the sorts of terrible countermeasures which we ultimately had to consider.
Well, there are oblique references, but it was not as... Obviously, if I went back and rewrote it now, it would be completely different.
Mr. Hancock, forgive us, though. I asked you basically what the worth of it was. You've accepted that there are only, in your words, oblique references to the sort of countermeasures which ultimately came to pass.
Yeah.
Schools is different because that's based on the genesis of the 2011 strategy. Your officials and others worked for weeks on it, for 3 weeks.
Yes.
It was informative and perhaps revelatory to some.
Yes.
As the government's sole strategy document, it had significant flaws.
It was, when it was commissioned, we were still on the strategy, which I have...
Explain.
I've been pretty clear that I am not a fan of the strategy the doctrine that we went into this pandemic.
So why did you sign off on it?
Because that was our thinking at the time. And by the time it had then been delayed and stuck in the Cabinet Office, it was better to have it out and driving action than not at all.
Nothing.
Yes.
All right. Can I ask you briefly, please, about 2 other relevant events around this time? Did you call, in fact, the World Health Organization about the need for a declaration of a pandemic? On the 2nd of March, it wasn't, in fact, announced till the 11th of March.
Yeah.
Had you also spoken to the World Health Organization earlier about their declaration, which you, as you saw it, was delayed
Yes.
because the PHEIC wasn't, in fact, announced until the 30th of January, notwithstanding an earlier committee debate at the WHO.
Correct. I mean, I pushed and pushed and pushed on the WHO on both of those declarations.
Well, I want that to be acknowledged.
I mean, what I haven't been able to find is a record of the 22nd of January call, which I remember, which is when I was told we can't have a PHIC because somebody's on a plane, and it was a ridiculous excuse. And I thought that there might be some politics. It's not worth, which is outside the remit of this.
Maybe you'll find that call in that little notebook that you've just produced.
It's not a notebook, it was a phone record.
All right. The 2nd of March, and another vital point, the Minister for Care was Helen Whately, was she not?
Yes.
At that time. You refer at paragraph 230 of your statement to how, at this time, the 2nd of March, your department and she made inquiries about the state of planning in the care sector.
Yes.
And was there a revelatory moment in relation to the state of planning, not countermeasure planning, but the planning broadly in the care sector?
Yes.
And what was that?
So our early position had been essentially the constitutional position, which is that care homes are legally responsible to, contracted by, local authorities, and therefore they reported action through local resilience to local authorities, through local resilience fora up to MHCLG, and the department is responsible for social care with respect to policy, but not to any of the legal contracting or indeed the reporting. That was the position going into the pandemic. It is anachronistic, and it has needed reform for a long time, and those reforms have been delayed. That was the position going in. Helen Whately then, in early March, came to the very firm view that not enough was happening. In February, we had discussions with the care sector. We'd had round tables. But the policy position going in was that local authorities are responsible, and it turned out that it was something else that we as a department had to grip.
Thank you for the description of the background. What you refer in paragraph 232, however, is that in terms of the planning, there is obviously an obligation on the sector, Mr. Hancock, to produce plans for itself.
Oh, yes.
Regardless of the financing, regardless of the funding, and so on and so forth. She appreciated, and she messaged you.
Yes.
She'd only been provided with 2 existing pandemic contingency plans in the whole of the care sector.
Yes.
And that's what she told you.
Yes, that's correct.
All right.
So I'm aware the LGA have said, no, there were more around. I don't know the facts of this. What I do know is what I was told, and I was told I'd asked to see them, and there were only 2, and they were inadequate.
All right. On the 12th of March, Sage was presented with some slides, 56209. At page 2, there is a reference in the first bullet point. Note, Sage advised that interventions 1 to 4 should each deliver benefits by delaying and flattening the peak and/or lowering overall deaths. If you just retain that thought, please, Mr. Hancock, which is the 12th of March, and we'll look at the COBRA minutes itself for the 12th of March, 56221. Page 5, it's a COBRA chaired by the Prime Minister. At page 5, paragraph 2, you were there. The chair invited the GCSA to outline the objectives of implementing the interventions. And you've explained how, of course, by this stage, there is now debate about the nature of the infection control interventions. The GCSA said that the aim was not to completely suppress the spread of the disease. Not only was this not possible, but it would likely lead to a larger second peak later in the year. So my question to you is this, is you've helpfully described that the reasonable worst case scenario debate didn't slow things down. The debate on what became behavioural fatigue did slow things down. To what extent did the debate about if you mitigate and you flatten a wave, if you suppress completely the wave and you go for an eradication policy or suppression policy, it may bounce back like an uncoiled spring, I've mixed my metaphors, later in the year. To what extent, if at all, did that concern or debate also ensure or lead to a slowing down of practical action being taken?
Hardly at all, because this argument by the Chief Scientific Advisor that we should aim to, with a good outcome of herd immunity by September 2020, this strategy or this objective was rapidly overtaken by the decision on the formally taken, I think, on either the 15th or the 16th, to ask people to end all unnecessary social contact.
Absolutely. That's the end of it.
Yeah. Well, that was the suppression strategy in full force by then.
Yes. When did the debate about flattening versus suppression,
over that
uncoiled spring,
Yeah.
first find its way into the WhatsApps, into the meetings, into Sage, into Cobra, and so on?
It happened very rapidly on the 13th, 14th, and 15th of March.
Well, I've put to you material from the 12th of March. There's a debate at Cobra 8 on the 9th of March about delaying a peak.
But that was all about what is the right time for the intervention.
So that was a debate about the point you mentioned earlier about the
Yes.
efficacy of intervention rather than uncoiled spring, if I can call it that.
I don't know really what you mean by uncoiled spring, but what
There's this concern that if you completely suppress the virus,
Yeah.
as soon as you lift the restrictions, it
Yeah.
will uncoil and come back
see.
with greater vengeance later.
as set out here. As the, short of without a vaccine, of course, that is a risk.
Of course.
That was discussed, but it was very, very brief. The point, the time in which that was the main concern was very brief.
All right. Now, whether one calls it a change in strategy or a dawning realization or an acceleration,
Yeah.
on that Friday, or perhaps the Thursday, the 12th of March, Friday the 13th, and the weekend of the 14th and 15th, the government took what may be considered to be a very significant change of direction.
Yes.
The inquiries received evidence that there was a body of scientific material built up by that stage from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine,
Yeah.
Professor Edmonds, Professor Ferguson at ICL,
Yeah.
also at Sage. There were papers from, in particular ICL, there were papers from Professor Riley. Professor Ferguson had emailed Ben Warner on the 10th of March. Sage on the 10th of March had been asked by Neil Ferguson, or rather the officials at Sage had been asked by Neil Ferguson, do they know what an epidemic with 4,000 deaths a day looks like? And there were, according to your witness statement, there was much more data available by that weekend on the likely impact on the NHS.
Yes.
Could you just assist with the contribution from the DHC in terms of that acceleration? It looks as if Mr. Cummings and some of his associates and colleagues and the scientists and the NHS were providing the stimulus, the spur to this acceleration. What was coming from the DHSC in terms of trying to change the position of the government? And that is a entirely open-ended question. Maybe you'll say you were the one who was pushing, or Sir Christopher Wormold was pushing. Can you assist us?
The clinical advice coming from the department was coming from Chris Whitty. My contribution in this period was that on the 12th, I decided at this point that we were going to have a UK-wide response, and of course health is a devolved matter, and we can come back if you want, to whether or not that's a good idea with a contagious disease as opposed to a health service. So I went to Edinburgh and then Belfast and Cardiff and discussed with my opposite numbers in the DAs. And then I had a G7 call, which I actually took in the health department in Cardiff. And that had a very, very significant impact on me because I heard directly from my Italian opposite number. And we thought the Italians had acted early, but he was saying he wished he'd acted earlier still. And this argument that you should delay and to time it right, he had no truck with. So that had a very significant impact on me. And that was the point at which I started actively agitating for very firm action for a lockdown. I spoke to the Prime Minister. I emailed him that evening. We've been through this a couple of times. So essentially what happened was that over the period for the first 2 weeks of March until then, we continued to work on all of the health-specific things that are necessary. The NHS response. It was at that time we were working on. We got the Nightingale Hospitals programme.
If I may get acute health measures, perhaps.
The measures directly within the Health and Social Care Department's remit.
Yep. The
question of lockdowns by then was correctly located within the Cabinet Office as the lead department on it. This had all happened since, which effectively was kicked off on the 2nd of March, Cobra, when the Prime Minister took the chair. So my time in that period was essentially focused on what are we going to need in the health and social care area, given that this is clearly coming.
On Saturday, the 14th of March, and I'm not going to take you through what you know to be the number of meetings which you attended.
Yeah.
That there were a number of crisis meetings attended by various people.
Yeah.
But you contributed to a WhatsApp group debate together with the Chief Scientific Advisor, the Chief Medical Officer, the Prime Minister and Mr. Cummings, pithily called the CSA, CMO, MAT, PM, DOM group, 48399, page 3. On the 14th, on the Saturday at 7:30, 7:30.49, it may be over the page. Yes, there we are. Thank you. There is a debate commenced by Mr. Cummings. I think we need to move fast on social distancing, work from home. Oldies shouldn't go to weddings, closing pubs, nightclubs, and so on and so forth. And then there's a debate, Mr. Hancock, just to refresh your memory, about how the public need to be informed as to the nature of the crisis and what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And Chris Whitty agrees. And you say this: we also need urgently to address the WHO criticisms of our approach.
Yes.
We need to ramp up testing, not stop testing.
Yes.
Just bearing in mind, of course, community testing had stopped on the 12th of March.
Yeah.
You had, and it's obvious from the paperwork, you'd openly recognised the alarming news that there was no sophisticated test and trace system beyond the first few hundred. And then you say we need to continue contact tracing and introduce self-contact tracing.
Yeah.
Both of these are in hand.
Yeah.
What did you mean by both of these are in hand?
On the 12th of March, it had been announced that we were going to stop community testing and stop contact tracing. I don't want to overplay it because I didn't actively stop it, but I was sceptical of whether we should stop these things. I'd been trying to drive up testing, trying to get PHE to engage the private sector in testing. And I basically, at this point, had the confidence to say what I previously thought, urged on by the WHO, which was, what on earth are we doing stopping these things? We need to keep driving.
Quite. But the testing in the community had stopped. There was no contact tracing thereafter in the community. There was
Not until I got it going again.
Quite. There was no self-contact tracing. Why did you say both of these are in hand?
Because by then I'd issued the instruction internally that we should not accept that these have to stop. Now, on
So
community...
could you just pause there? Could you please help the inquiry with what those instructions were and when they were?
I don't know the detail of them, but what I remember is, firstly, that the approaches were different on testing and on contact tracing.
Indeed.
On testing, the problem at this point was that we didn't have enough tests for community testing. And you'll know that the action that I took, both of these are in hand, the action I took with David Halpin and Will Waugh, who was at number 10, was that we arranged a meeting on the 17th of March to try to electrify the growth of testing. And at that meeting, I took the responsibility for testing from PHE back into the department and drove it very hard from there, and I'm happy to answer any questions on that.
Forgive me, Mr. Hancock, you said you'll know that the action I took.
What?
You said you'll know that the action that I took, etc., and therefore
On testing.
this is on hand.
Well, sorry,
I
I
must
set it
put
out.
to you, I don't give evidence. I've never given evidence in these proceedings, but you cannot say you, the inquiry, will know that. The inquiry does not know that you took any of those steps or that both of these are in hand.
I apologise. I should have said, as I set out in my written statement, I took the responsibility from testing from PHE into the department, and we set up the 4 pillars that became 5 pillars, that became the 100,000 testing target, that became test and trace. The second thing is on contact tracing. We'd stopped, PHE had stopped contact tracing, and the action that we took after this was to restart contact tracing and do it at large scale using a scale model of how to deliver it rather than a specialist model, if I put it that way, and also introduce self-contact tracing, which became the app. So that is what I mean by both of these are in hand. It's shorthand for two absolutely enormous programs that came from this.
They'd all started by the 14th of March.
I kicked it off after. What happened was I basically was uncomfortable with these decisions that were made by that were advised, but I accepted them. So I accept responsibility, but I was uncomfortable with them. The WHO criticised us for them, and I listened very carefully to that WHO criticism and essentially reversed the decisions.
I think what the point Mr. Keith is getting at is, were these all in hand by the 14th of March, accepting all that you said?
Well, by in hand, what I mean is we're getting on with making them happen.
Right.
We didn't have a big testing program. These things take months to build rather than being immediate. But the reason I put both of these in hand, I didn't want to say this is a decision that I'm asking you, Prime Minister, to opine on. I'm just saying I have got on with this.
I'll move on to the next point. The lockdown decision. You have candidly and openly already acknowledged today that with hindsight, we should have locked down much earlier, and you've given a helpful indication as to when that might have been possible. I just would like, please, to take you to paragraph 23 of your witness statement, where you set out in broad terms that view. It's page 6 of the major statement, but I think it's important that absolutely on the record of your statement, we can see how you've put it. With hindsight and information we did not have at the time, it's now obvious that we should have locked down much earlier. I say that with hindsight. It was not at all clear at the time. The scientific caution over locking down was based on uncertainty over how the public would respond and poor data. And you explain how new evidence came to light, and of course SAGE says we're further along the epidemiological trajectory than it had understood, and so on and so forth. The discussion was centred on the timing of the lockdown because of strong advice for example, from independent scientific pandemic insights group SPI-B, that people would likely only put up with lockdown for a short period of time. That advice, you say, clearly turned out to be wrong. Can I press you, please, then, for clarity? Are you saying that the only reason that we did not lock down earlier was because of that advice from SPI-B, along with the data problem, which you identify earlier in the paragraph, but which advice you say clearly turned out to be wrong?
At this time, information was still sparse. The first death in the UK had happened on the 1st of March, and the case numbers were still, compared to what came later, very low. And so you have to understand these decisions in the context of what we did know and a lot of what we didn't know. So that's why I have a different view with hindsight to compared to what happened at the time. I think it is the case that the concern over timing the lockdown correctly was the main reason why it wasn't put in place sooner. But it's also true that SAGE changed its advice in terms of where we were on the epidemiological curve because of new data that came to light.
All right.
They thought previously we were around 4 weeks, quotes, behind Italy, which was the metric that we were using. Now, with hindsight, it didn't matter whether we were behind Italy 2 weeks or 4 weeks. We should have been, as soon as you know you've got to lock down, you've got to lock down. But this was the data that came to light. And in fact, David Halpern put it rather, he reminded me of a phone conversation I had with him when he was the first person to report on the key SAGE meeting to me. I later had a formal readout from the CMO, as I always did, but I heard from Halpern, and I remember being relieved because the anecdotal data I was getting out of the NHS and others was that this was going up the reasonable worst case scenario curve, and then it was formally came to us through SAGE that that's what was happening, and the irony was that to me didn't feel like new information. It felt like formal confirmation of what I'd been picking up from from analysing the data myself.
2 points, please, Mr. Hancock. You referred to SAGE, of course, saying, well, we're not as far behind Italy as we understood we were.
Yeah.
If I may suggest, it must be right to say it just didn't matter, because nothing that you and the DHSC or nothing in the Cabinet Office was doing, nothing that SAGE and NervTag and all the other various parts of government was doing had been throughout February and early March predicated on what is Italy doing. Italy was doing what Italy was doing. So there can be no suggestion that any failure, if there is a failure, and if Milady finds there's a failure to impose the lockdown earlier, what was because of a misjudged reliance upon where Italy was in the epidemiological trajectory.
No, on the contrary. On the contrary, if I may explain.
If you just accept that proposition, we're in agreement. The United Kingdom government wasn't planning its response between January, February, March, and the 14th of March on what is Italy doing. It was just a feature.
If I can explain, if you think that the timing, if you think you've only got a limited period lockdown that you can put in place, the timing of that lockdown matters. And watching the Italian curve was the best way of thinking what would happen here. And so the Italy data were important in that sense. And then you had to judge, compared to where we were on Italy, where to bring in the lockdown. And indeed, we brought in the lockdown earlier in the epidemiological curve than Italy and others did. My point is not about whether or not it's right to base yourself off Italy. My point is the whole doctrine of waiting, sort of allowing it to come towards you and hold, and now we go. That was wrong. Instead, the moment you need a lockdown, you need to lock down.
Indeed. I was making a point for the absence of any confusion or doubt that there was no doctrinal approach taken by the United Kingdom government necessarily predicated on the Italian approach?
No,
Of course
it was that Italy was an example.
Indeed.
Yeah.
The second point is this, is that the clinical advice, as you describe it in your own statement, to the effect that going early would limit effectiveness,
Yeah.
that is obviously and plainly an issue relevant to a lockdown decision, a mandatory stay-at-home order, because that is, just wait, that is obviously the ultimate decision. It's a stay-at-home backed by force of law. To what extent does that behavioural fatigue notion explain or mitigate either delays in the system of operation of government, if that's what my lady finds it there to have been, or in the promulgation of plans, or in any failure just to say how it was, control is lost, the wave is coming, we must practically act now? Where do we put the behavioural fatigue fallacy into the general picture?
It had an impact on the decision both to recommend actions to the public, which is an NPI because communications are an NPI, and the mandatory decisions that came thereafter, notably the closure of schools and then the full legal lockdown on the 23rd. I see the period from the 16th to the 23rd as essentially a ratcheting up of lockdown. We went for a non-mandatory lockdown, followed by closure of schools, followed by mandatory lockdown. The same behavioural fatigue argument applied to all three. They are just different levels of NPI.
Right. And now, but perhaps before a break, I want to ask you about the rationale for the lockdown. It is vital, Mr. Hancock, and the inquiry has done this in relation to a number of witnesses at great length, to examine the rationale both for and against the imposition of the lockdown decision of the 23rd of March, on the premise it was the right decision, but also on the contrary position that it was the wrong decision. So you've already explained how your position is it was the right decision and indeed should have been done with hindsight considerably earlier. I want to just briefly look at the counter-argument.
Yeah.
It is obvious from the evidence in Cobra, the evidence before the Prime Minister, and in particular the Cobra meeting of Friday the 20th of March, chaired by Michael Gove, that material was being placed before the relevant bodies to suggest, firstly, if we don't proceed to the final ultimate mandatory, backed by law, stay-at-home order, there will be many more deaths than there would otherwise be. And secondly, that the impact upon the NHS, if those further final steps are not taken, will be devastating. The paperwork shows that on the Monday, the 23rd of March, there was a great deal of debate about non-compliance during the previous weekend, attendance at parks and so on and so forth. There is, by contrast, very little debate on the face of the minutes from the 23rd of March of the data relating to the likely impact on the NHS and also on how many more deaths will be incurred if those steps aren't taken. Do you follow? And as the Secretary of State, I want to ask you, how clear were you that the data showing the terrible consequences of not acting, how robust was it? How clearly was the position set out?
Well, by the 23rd of March, the trajectory of those data was unknowable because the trajectory on the 16th was knowable, predicted, and the reasonable worst-case scenario was happening. Of course, we took very significant action on the 16th. The stay-at-home request, if I put it that way, undoubtedly changed people's behaviour and therefore will have reduced R.
Indeed.
Because of the 2-week lag from a change in the behaviour of the public to a change in the measured case rate, we had no idea by how much it had reduced R. However, we took the view on the 20th that we needed to close schools. Previously, we'd been hoping to get to Easter and then Easter school holidays and then consider whether they reopen after the Easter school holidays. But by the 20th, we decided this was continuing to go up the reasonable worst case scenario. We need to pull that lever too. And then by the 21st, it essentially, the data that we considered on the 16th with the data going up the reasonable worst case scenario continued up the reasonable worst case scenario. These are cases where people had caught it a couple of weeks earlier. So we had a greater confidence that we were on the reasonable worst case scenario, which is a terrible confidence to have, and therefore decided to go the full measure. So pull every lever available to us, and that was the consideration. So by the 23rd, there wasn't a new forecast of what would happen under the measures that were extant at that point, because it would be 2 weeks before we knew the actual impact on the 16th. It is entirely reasonable to argue that the measures on the 16th themselves would have got R below 1, but it is entirely unknowable whether that argument is true or not. I think it's false. And therefore, so I hope this is making sense, because it's about how we essentially it got worse and worse along the lines of the reasonable worst case scenario. And my objective at that point was to get as many levers pulled as hard as possible to stop the NHS from being overwhelmed. And the NHS being overwhelmed is incredibly important, because as soon as you run out of hospital capacity, the IFR itself goes up, and you get more deaths from non-COVID related health problems, and because people can't get treatment. So the point of overwhelming hospitals is not just because there's a moral duty to treat everybody. It's because the number of deaths gets materially worse because essentially the people die because they don't get treatment, and that's what we needed to stop at that point, and therefore we pulled everything.
I've asked you about the data. The inquiry well understands the risks of direct and indirect mortality. You've said on the 16th of March, very significant action was taken. Those are your words. Mm-hmm. And of course, additional action was taken on the 20th, mm-hmm. the closure of schools ordained by Cobra on the 18th. The point is this, Mr. Hancock. On the premise, which must be a reasonable premise, that the measures imposed on the 16th and 20th of March were designed to work, and were imposed because the government thought this will bring R below 1. Why was more time not allowed the following week for those sensible measures, which in good faith the government had imposed, to see whether or not R would come down as far as would be necessary to prevent the collapse of the NHS, which might happen on an exponential growth curve at some indeterminate point in the future? There wasn't data before anybody saying, and your answer may be, it's impossible to provide a clear answer because you're dealing with the context of an exponential growth curve.
Correct.
But there doesn't appear to be any debate about, just bluntly, we've done all this the previous week. The previous week's measures are very dramatic.
Yeah.
It was on the 20th of March an order that all non-essential retail and travel and everything was shut by advice.
Yeah.
Schools were shut. The next step on the Monday was producing or backing it with the force of law. Why did nobody say, just hold on? We don't have to do this. We've only just done these prior measures 3 days before. We are entitled to conclude that the R rate is being reduced. There is a high level of compliance, but not as high as we would like and not as high as the data would suggest is required. Let's see whether or not our measures work, at least for a few more days, in order in order to pause and assess your very own steps
Yes.
before the ultimate,
Yes.
the most divisive, politically divisive and unprecedented step is taken?
Gosh, there's so many questions in what you've just
There were.
put. The first thing is, it wasn't actually politically divisive.
No, it's become. Yeah, I apologise. I'm not suggesting it was then. It is now.
Well, so, there is a. Some people forget what actually happened, but it wasn't divisive at all. There was enormous consensual support across very large swathes of the population and almost all political leaders. And in fact, the fact it happened in all four nations, led by 5 political parties, not even 4 political parties at the same time, demonstrates that. Anyway, I set that to one side. I think on the data, the reasons are twofold. The first is to do with what I said before. The exponential growth was happening. Thankfully, as a trained economist, I'm used to dealing with exponential curves and understanding of the stats and maths behind them. We had greater and greater confidence that we were on the reasonable worst-case scenario path, and that would lead to over 500,000 deaths happening. The problem with those forecasts was that they were coming true. And people have criticised the forecast, and of course the forecast didn't happen because we took action. And so that's the first thing, increased confidence that the worst was happening. The second thing is that at the same time, we did have an assessment of the sorts of levels of reduction of human interaction that would be needed to get R below 1. Because if R is at 3, to get it below 1, you need to reduce by 2/3 human interactions at a rule of thumb level. And we were not seeing that level of reduction. I think the SAGE papers said that they were looking for an 80% reduction in 75 to get in human interactions to have confidence to get R below 1, because we thought it was between 3 and 4. That was not happening. So there are the 2 data points, if you like.
That's very clear. The COBRA minutes of the Monday indeed show that the compliance rate was not up at 75%, but it describes the broad direction of travel as having some positive trends. Tube travel, attendances at shops and work and attendance and so on and so forth showed that there were very significant drops in attendance. And so broadly speaking, there was a degree of significant compliance. But you've identified that the primary objective of the government was to take action to meet the reasonable worst-case scenario, that is to say, to make sure that it didn't come to pass in its full horror. But you'd taken very significant steps just 3 days before. Why procedurally, well, why not in terms of process, could you not have waited a few more days to see whether or not the steps you'd already taken would bring about the very response to the reasonable worst-case scenario that you had taken those steps in the first place to meet?
Because we didn't just want to not hit the reasonable worst-case scenario of 500,000 deaths. We wanted to reduce that very significantly, not least to ensure that the NHS wasn't
Of course. I'm sorry.
Overtopped.
Of course. Strategically, that must be right.
Yes.
Let me put it another way. The plan was to reduce R below 1.
Yes.
As quickly and as efficiently and as speedily as you could. On the Friday, you had introduced a suite of measures, or a combined suite of measures, designed to bring R below 1. On Friday, that is what you thought would do the trick. By Monday, there was a realization it wouldn't work. It wasn't working, COBRA surmised, because the data showed that the level of compliance with the measures weren't high enough. Why wasn't more time allowed to see whether they would reach that level of compliance, at which point you could be assured that the measures from the Friday were working?
2 reasons. Firstly, because we expected that the impact on people's behaviour would start as a maximum and then degrade. In the end, the public were brilliant at, that there wasn't that degradation at all, but that's what we were worried about. The second is that, from my point of view as the Health Secretary, my absolute, totally primary task at this point was to ensure that nobody went without NHS provision. And that needed a very significant reduction from the reasonable worst case scenario. And we only just got it low enough. So from my seat, I was just in favour of all the action you could possibly take. And I knew there'd be other voices that would argue for caution. And in fact, we did. The marginal item was whether we should mandate the closure of outdoor building sites. And in the end, we did not mandate that. But they almost entirely closed anyway. So there was an argument about how far do we go. And we effectively pulled every lever except that one. But the building trade decided to pull it for us.
We're going to stop there, Mr.
Yes.
Chief, I'm afraid. Otherwise, I'm going to have rebelling stenographers. I'm sorry, because it is mid-discussion. I should come back at 25 past. Mr. Keith.
My lady, in the course of no doubt an overlong question, I suggested at some point earlier today that SAGE had not debated social distancing countermeasures until I said the 24th of March. In fact, it's the 25th of March. I think Mr. Hancock thought it was the 26th of February. I'm so sorry, of February. I've been asked by Mr. Hill to make absolutely clear, and I'm delighted to do so, there was a debate on the 4th of February at SAGE about face masks, schools, PP, and a number of measures. On the 13th of February, there was debate about mass gatherings, school, work, and prisons, and a number of other areas, and that the full suite, if I may call them that, of countermeasures was discussed on the 25th. So the lockdown, being one example, was on the 25th. One final question, please, in relation to the lockdown decision, Mr. Hancock. Could we just have up 274026? This is a summary, and the inquiry doesn't expect you to read through it or to recollect, if you have, the detail of it. It's a summary of the references from SAGE meetings, COBRA meetings, ministerial meetings, and so on and so forth, of how the likely damage to the NHS, the impact, was put at various times. So sometimes there are references to the NHS being overwhelmed, to it being overtopped. If we can come forward, please, and it'll mean scrolling through to about page 7 or 8. A bit more, please. We've got there the 21st of March, the ministerial group meeting over the weekend, where some figures are given about ITU beds. This is just to get your bearings, Mr. Hancock. And then if we go further forward one page, we will see information from the Chief Executive of the NHS about the number of beds, ventilated beds, number of beds in London, and so on. You'll see that there's a reference by the Government Chief Scientific Advisor 4 lines down from the bullet point relating to him. The worst case scenario was that ITU capacity in London would be overwhelmed, so he uses the word overwhelmed in 9 days' time.
Yeah.
But the projection, the actuality, 15 days. And then if we scroll through further in the document, you will see the 22nd of March ministerial group meeting, current number of deaths, number of beds, and a reference to the drive to free up capacity. 23rd of March, of course, the Monday, how the NHS is being stretched in intensive care, and over the page 11, the COBRA and the Cabinet meeting 23rd, 24th. It is obvious, and you've described to the inquiry how COBRA and the Prime Minister rationalised that the NHS would be overwhelmed at some point if R continued on its exponential growth and was not brought below 1, inevitably, as certain as night follows day, the NHS would collapse because of the sheer number of deaths.
Yes. Not because of the sheer number of deaths, because of the cases.
Cases and deaths, But the point is that the NHS would not survive because of the nature of an exponential growth. To what extent did the government collectively have a view as to when that point might be likely to arrive? And I put it that way because you've explained, as has Professor Sir Chris Whitty, that the final analysis was based upon the correct understanding that an exponential growth would only ever end in disaster for the NHS. For
the NHS, yes.
But could you, and were you able to go any further in terms of understanding when that was likely to be? Would it be an overtop? Would it be an overwhelming? Would it be a complete collapse? Would it be in a matter of weeks? Would surge capacity be able to ameliorate the position? Explain what level of understanding was.
I mean, in a way, the true answer to that question is nobody fully knew what that would look like, but we knew that it would be catastrophic. And in the paperwork, as you've just shown, when making the decision on the 23rd, the advice was 9 days in the reasonable worst case scenario, 15 days in the central scenario. But at that point, my worry was we were going up the reasonable worst case scenario, notwithstanding the decisions we'd taken on the 16th and the 20th. What that would look like, what that would mean, would be people going without treatment. And I was absolutely determined that that would not happen. And that came back to the Nimbus discussion and other discussions around that. And so we took a huge amount of action, and I thought that Lord Stevens described that extremely well in his evidence. I pushed for him to expand both the physical capacity and expand the effective staffing, because one of the challenges that has been put at this stage is that, and it's there in some of the written evidence to the inquiry, that we didn't know exactly how many beds the NHS had, in quotes. Well, what matters is not a physical bed, what matters is a staffed bed, and that is flexible. In some cases, we took the staff ratio in intensive care, normally 1-to-1, up to 6 patients to 1 nurse. So it is flexible. The NHS would, you said in your question, would the NHS have survived? Of course the NHS would have survived. It would have done its level best and is an amazing and adaptable institution full of extraordinary people. But it would not have been able to provide care to everybody. And therefore, the number of people who died would have gone up even more than it would have done just because of the virus.
And therefore, is this a fair summary? Notwithstanding the remarkable ability of the NHS to cope, notwithstanding the flexibility that there may be in the system for an increase in staff beds, in ICU beds, in surge capacity.
Yes.
Notwithstanding that you could not know and you would never know at what point collapse would come, it was a risk that no Secretary of State responsible for public health could countenance.
Yes, that is a good summary.
Right. Some other issues, please, Mr. Hancock. Public Health England, the inquiry has understood that Public Health England was disbanded in the middle of the pandemic, to use one of the witness statements. Did you have concerns about the ability of Public Health England in February, March, April to respond to the pandemic? And if so, was that a contributory factor to the disbandment of PHE and its substitution by the UK HSA?
Yes, I did. Public Health England did an absolutely superb job, especially on the scientific research. And the best early example was developing the test in an extremely short period of time. And in its lab work and its analysis, it was first rate. Its genomics program was superb. There was one point in the pandemic when we were sequencing half of the genomes of COVID in the world. However, my view on this accords very closely with Chris Wormwold's evidence, which is that its capacity to scale was simply not there. It hadn't had the experience of scaling. This isn't a criticism of any individuals. It had a contact tracing system that was based on top quality, highly trained experts, whereas what we needed was much more like a call center Henry Ford style high volume contact tracing system that we eventually built. It was deeply frustrating that there was a unenthusiasm, if I put it diplomatically, to engage private sector testing capacity, and I personally had to get involved in sorting that out.
Can I just pause you there? You refer in your statement to a particular problem in relation to the extent to which PHE found itself able to assist a particular commercial entity in its development of a test.
No, the problem was that it wouldn't engage any private commercial entity. There were a couple, which I mentioned in my statement, who I asked them to contact because they'd come to me. I wanted them to support any private entity that could expand testing. It wasn't about these particular companies. What I wanted was testing capacity. There was a view, which was that there is across the country a large number of very small university or hospital-based and a couple of PHE-based labs, and that we should use these. But they were not scalable models. They were small, and they were essentially structured for science rather than structured for throughput. And so my concerns with PHE were really about its inability to scale. That was the first. The second was about a longer term change that I thought was needed. And this was the problem of PHE having two goals.
Is this the health improvement?
Correct. It was responsible for health improvement, that is, improvement of people's health with respect to non-communicable diseases, obesity being the most important, but anti-smoking drives, for instance, PHE was very strong in these areas, as well as responsible for communicable diseases, either the normal ones that happen all the time, the occasional outbreak of Legionnaire's disease or Mpox or what have you, and preparation for very rare but extremely high consequence communicable diseases akin to a pandemic. And I have a background at the Bank of England, and it is akin to financial stability. Most of the time there isn't a problem with financial stability, but when there is a problem with financial stability, you absolutely need an institution that is going to lead in the response, and we have one. It's the Bank of England.
All right.
We did not have the equivalent, and now we do because of UXA.
The second point you mentioned, the systemic change, if you like, to recognise that the new body focuses on health prevention, is plainly understood. Was it, in relation to the first point, though, truly the fault of Public Health England that it was unable to scale up the testing process? I mean, wasn't that a reflection of historical institutional failings? There just wasn't a system in place, and nobody, let alone PHE, could have scaled up in January, even if they'd been minded to do so. Do you think practically it had been open to them to take those steps, but that they failed to do so?
I don't want to ascribe blame. It would have been better for the UK response had those companies that were experienced in diagnostics, albeit relatively small scale, especially compared to some countries like Germany, had been given the full-hearted support with the sputum they needed, for instance, early on. From mid-March, we did manage to develop this sort of capacity. It was slower than it ought to have been, and it's a vital lesson for the future that we need a testing system ready to go. And I'm worried that that is not there right now in case it's a pandemic. Maybe what happens if one of these diseases that we've read about in the last couple of weeks, the influenza in northern China, becomes pandemic. We need to be able to. My question now to the Secretary of State would be, how quickly can we get to 100,000 tests? How quickly are we going to get a vaccine? How quickly are we going to have 5,000 people in a call centre doing contact tracing?
Do you happen to know for a fact whether or not the hugely impressive and extremely extensive testing system that was, of course, ultimately put into place has become degraded since the end of the crisis, or whether it is still in place?
No, of course it's been stepped down. But you'd want to step some of it down. We built a capacity of almost 1 million tests a day. You don't need 1 million tests a day in normal times. What you need is the ability very rapidly to put it back in place. So, yes, for instance,
Mr. Hancock, I'm sorry to interrupt. You said, I'm worried that is not there right now.
Correct.
Case. So I'm asking you, do you know that it is now not there? Or are you saying it is still there, it's been stepped down reasonably, but you've got concerns about whether it can be stepped back up?
That is what I'm concerned about. For instance, there were recently one of the major labs was put on the market. I think it would be better if it were mothballed and ready to go at the flick of a switch.
All right.
And can I just make one point on this? We spend £50 billion a year on physical defence, and we spend less than £500 million a year on UXA. We spend less than 1% of our total budget for defence on health security, yet health security failings have killed more civilians than any other external threat since the Second World War, and maybe even further back than that. And I think this is a spectacular imbalance in the amount of resources that we put into defence of this country against say, a terror threat compared to a health threat. And I've got one particular axe to grind. I attended the National Security Council in my role as Secretary of State occasionally. The head of UXA should be on the National Security Council all of the time, not just brought in when there's a health issue on the agenda, because health security threats have been demonstrated to be the biggest threat to the civilian population of this country.
Previous witness observed that had this been a threat,
yes,
in national security terms rather
yes,
than a risk,
yes,
in public health terms, that the government may have, well, it would have had different structures in place, but it may have responded significantly differently.
It would have had basically the same structures in place. It would have used them. Imagine if I'd gone to...
I'm going to ask you very, very politely, just not to go any further. We understand, Mr. Hancock, the point you make, and you've made this point in your witness statement. We understand the point about the difference between national security and threats and risks.
One sentence. If I'd gone in mid-January to the Cabinet Secretary setting out a 50-50 chance of a terrorist threat that might kill 500,000 people, I think the Prime Minister would have chaired the Cobra, not me. Don't you?
I don't answer the questions here, Mr. Hancock. But there is obviously force in your observation. But can I ask you to move it forward? It may or may not be that the absence of a chairing of that first Cobra by the Prime Minister made a difference. That's a matter for my lady to determine. Can you go further and say that over the course of perhaps the following 4 weeks, there would have been a material difference in the whole system response?
Yes.
Right.
So I didn't specifically mean the very first one. It was reasonable very early on. The responses were almost entirely within the health remit. That would have been like an MOD minister, the Defence Secretary chairing a Cobra on a defence matter. Totally reasonable at first. But when it became clear this was a 50-50 threat, given the reasonable worst-case scenario, then the whole National Security Secretariat and civil contingencies apparatus which exists should have been brought to bear on this crisis. And instead, what happened was a special advisor in Number 10 decided to try to make all the decisions out of his office.
Mr. Hancock, again, you've overly focused, if I may say so, on the structure and the committee structure. My lady would be much more assisted, I think, by understanding whether, if it had been a national security threat, that not just would there have been changes in the application or the approach or the utilisation of the committee structure, but would there have been a material response in the way in which the government responded practically in terms of the measures, the actions, the steps it might thereafter then take?
Yes.
Right. Thank you. The 100,000 test goal of April.
Yes.
I don't wish to linger on this subject. It is self-evident that it was a very considerable and impressive feat to ramp up the testing so that we can understand what the debate is, from 10,000 a day at the end of March to 100,000 a day at the end of April. The inquiry has, however, received or has seen that there is evidence in the WhatsApps and the private communications that would consider a degree of criticism of you in relation to that feat. I'd like to suggest to you, and you will have no doubt reflected upon this, that there doesn't appear to have been criticism of the result or the ambition, which, as I say, appear to be very impressive, but that there was a lack of coordination first. That appears to be one criticism. And secondly, a worry that by focusing on the end date, the end of April, and by pulling the system towards that focus, it may have taken necessary focus away from other areas for which testing was no less important. Do you understand the point?
I've tried to understand this point. It doesn't have a logical basis,
well,
but it was made at the time.
We presume you will reject it.
Yeah, certainly will.
Okay. But, Mr. Hancock,
so for this reason, it is very, very serious, because I now know that there were people actively working against me on it in the centre, which is appalling.
Just pause there. Is that because you say in your statement that Number 10 intervened in the ramping up of testing capacity, which made it harder to achieve the goal? That's your statement.
Well, what Simon Case described to me as the long screwdriver, which is relatively junior people in Number 10 trying to go into the testing programme at a level too far down, too low, and issue diktats, was deeply unhelpful over this period. And proper lines of accountability would have been, following proper lines of accountability would have been much more effective. But that wasn't quite what I meant. What I meant was the criticism that instead of going for 100,000 tests, there were other things tests could have been used for, is wrong, and wrong in logic, because we needed the tests. Of course, we also needed to work out what we were going to use the tests for, and that was essentially a clinical decision. But what I needed to do from when I took over the responsibility for testing in the middle of, on March the 17th, was drive the system, galvanise the system, as somebody put it, quite right, and announcing a target, even though I didn't know that we could hit it, which is unusual in government. Normally, people only do things they're pretty sure they can achieve. That was absolutely critical to driving the expansion of testing, which was so necessary in the rest of the response. It is, of course, it's frustrating to me that in so doing, and in taking that approach, obviously some people were upset by it. It baffles me why people were against the expansion of testing in that way. Right.
On the 1st of May, the Cabinet Secretary WhatsApped you to say, "Hi, Matt. Well done this evening. Creative counting and 122,000." You respond, although it looks like question marks, in fact, it was a 3-kiss emoji.
I told you we got on well.
Well, yes, but you appear also to be accepting his perhaps jocular observation that you'd engage in creative counting.
This reference is about how we went about counting a a new innovation, which was tests that people did at home, on which there was work in the department. The permanent secretary...
Mr. Hancock, I'm so sorry. In the interest of time, can I just ask you, and I'm doing this in order to be scrupulously fair to you, do you accept or reject the suggestion of creative counting?
I reject it, and on every different way you could possibly count these measures, we hit that target.
All right. Care homes. The detail of the adult care sector is for a later module, as I know you know. But a considerable amount of evidence has been given by in the context of this module about the centre of government's understanding of what the position was, firstly in relation to the discharge of patients from hospital to the care sector, and secondly, the extent of the testing that was available both for patients and also for staff in the care sector thereafter and at a later stage.
Yeah.
And therefore, I need to ask you briefly again what your reaction is. The evidence has been given to this effect and you've already referred to this. The government's starting point is, of course, that local authorities manage and deal with risks in adult social care. That was evidence from Sir Chris Wormold. But it was also recognised, particularly in March, that the care sector presented particular vulnerabilities and problems.
That was recognised in February when we saw that older people were the most vulnerable.
Yes, I refer to March because you opened a coronavirus and social care meeting, a specific meeting on this issue on the 6th of March. And you refer to the higher risks attendant upon the sector. On the 17th of March, the government announced, NHS England issued a letter, as you'll well recall, requesting all parts of the NHS to free up maximum inpatient and critical care capacity. And the government issued its hospital discharge requirements on the 19th of March. And thereafter, patients began to be moved, when they were medically able to do so, from hospitals to the care sector. Can you please make absolutely plain whether or not those discharges to care homes from the 18th of March onwards were contingent in any way upon a negative test being available and applied?
In March, they were not.
Were any assurances given by you or others that testing would be in place for patients discharged from that date onwards?
The assurances that I gave were very precisely the policies that were in place at that time.
It's not a trap. There were, as far as we can tell, no assurances given by anybody that anybody would be tested from the 18th of March prior to discharge. It's plain.
Yeah, I've been accused of various things over this.
Will you bear with me? I'm going to come to the substance of the debate in a moment, but I wish you to acknowledge that the suggestion that from the 18th of March patients should have been tested but were not has no legs in it. There were no assurances.
No, we didn't have enough tests.
Precisely. There is a DHSC document dated the 2nd of April, 233798. And it says on page 4, negative tests, you can see it's the sentence towards the bottom, Mr.
Yeah.
Negative tests are not required prior to transfers admissions into the care home.
That's right.
But on page 5, there was guidance given that any care home resident presenting with symptoms...
Yeah.
I've now lost... Oh, yes, thank you very much. Any resident presenting with symptoms of Covid-19 should be promptly isolated and separated in a single room with a separate bathroom, if, of course, as we can see from the heading, they were already residents.
Yes.
Right. So that's very clear. Subsequently, and I don't want to go through the detail of them, there were announcements about testing of symptomatic care home staff.
Yes.
15th of April. There was an action plan for adult social care. There was an announcement on the 28th of April for asymptomatic staff and resident care homes for over 65s. Another announcement on the 7th of June, all about testing.
Yes.
Was the core point this, that whilst the government could announce a policy of testing, because for the very reason you've identified there was a shortage of testing, it could give no guarantees as to whether testing in reality would meet that aspiration? Out with your control, there may and were have been occasions, maybe many occasions, when testing was not available due to the exigencies of the system. But that's nothing to do with the policy announced by government. Is that a fair summary?
It's a little bit more complex than that, and if I might have the opportunity to set it out a little bit, it is certainly true that, especially in a pandemic, if you make a policy decision at the centre, then it takes time and it is sometimes uneven in how that is promulgated. That's true across all policy, especially when done at pace. Nevertheless, even having said that, the testing policies that we put in place for adult social care were essentially based on clinical advice of what tests would be reliable and effective, combined with the operational advice of how many tests were available. So, for instance, there was a discussion on the 14th of April when clinical advice for the first time said, yes, you can test asymptomatic people and a negative test will be reliable, really important, apropos our earlier discussion. But then we combined that with the operational advice as to how many tests were available, by that stage around 35,000. And you can see, for instance, in INQ 000292608, that then the clinical advisors, in this case the CMO, came back and then signed off on and issued new advice as to what the policy should be for testing. So the testing rules, who got the tests, what the policy was, what order of priority we used tests in, was based on clinical advice throughout.
All right, that is understood, and nobody has suggested otherwise. The point I'm making is a different one, which is the DHSC, your clinical advisors, whoever it was who promulgated the policies, could not day in, day out practically at residential care sector level guarantee everybody a test or practically make them available. This was an extremely complex, difficult system, and you could not ensure or guarantee that there would be tests available for everyone in accordance with the policy. So it's impossible.
Yes. However, what I'm saying is when we were devising the policy, we tried to take that into account as much as possible, but you can't take it into account entirely.
Of course. I mean, that's, if I may say, it's an obvious point.
Yeah.
So in the WhatsApp group to which you were a contributor, the group I've mentioned earlier, CSA, CMO, MAT, PM, DOM, you will recall, Mr. Hancock, that in May, Mr. Cummings says, I don't understand why we're still not testing more care home staff, including asymptomatic.
Yeah.
And Sir Patrick Vallon says the testing is fully owned in DHSC. If we don't get on top of the spread, we risk the rest. And you say, we've been doing this for the past week, and that's dated the 3rd of May, and that must be a reference back to probably the 28th of April policy, or perhaps one of the earlier policies. Mr. Cummings, as you know, sends round a message saying we're negligently killing the most vulnerable, and I'm extremely worried. Trying to be as neutral as you can in terms of your dealings with Mr. Cummings, was this explosive, the communications are very explosive, this explosive row as to what was being done, a reflection of that difficulty that policy may not reflect the reality of what tests were actually in place up and down the land in the care sector?
It was a reflection, in my opinion, of two things. The first is you can find examples on the ground where the policy set in Whitehall doesn't match entirely. But it's also a reflection of the fact that, unfortunately, the Prime Minister's chief advisor didn't always try to ascertain the facts before making comments. He did this over the testing target towards the end of March, which we hit when he provided misinformation to the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Hancock, I've given you ample opportunity to comment on the allegations that Mr. Cummings has made about you.
The point is they're false. So you can't actually take anything that he wrote in that as true, because in that case it didn't accord with the facts. And I just gave another example, and therefore it's quite difficult to answer in a substantive way about the planning of future pandemics when the comments that I was receiving were not based on the truth.
All right. Protective ring. On the 15th of May, you said at a Downing Street press conference, right from the start, it's been clear that this horrible virus affects older people most. So right from the start, we've tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes. And you say, we've tried. You denied on a show on the 6th of June using the words right from the start. And in another place in Parliament, and I breach no parliamentary privilege rule by stating as a matter of fact, because I'm not addressing the merits of what was said in Parliament, you said we absolutely did throw a protective ring around social care. So that's the context. Going back to the press conference, you said right from the start, it's been clear we tried to throw a protective ring. Do you acknowledge that the phrase trying to throw a protective ring and the reference to right from the start was open to interpretation? People would take from those words what they wished, and there's certainly an argument for saying that that was giving the clear impression that there was a impermeable barrier, whether in terms of finance, fiscal support, testing, or discharge staff residential movements within the care sector.
I entirely understand why people feel strongly about this. When I first said that, I then went on to explain what I meant, that we'd put over £3 billion into the care sector in March and April, that we'd released PPE, free PPE, that we'd put in place infection control guidance based on the scientific advice, etc. And in fact, in that press conference, I went on to list the different things that we were doing. And in fact, as part of the plan we were launching that day, we made another £600 million available for infection control purposes. And so I was trying to simply summarise that we had taken action, and I set out the action.
That is understood. I cannot improve on the glorious words of Professor Sir Jonathan Van Tam, who says in his statement, "My view is a ring is a circle without a break in it." However you describe the protective processes you put in place around the care sector, they did not form an unbroken circle, did they?
It is quite clear from the evidence that Professor Van Tam is right.
Yeah, thank you. On the 13th of May, so around the same time, could we have 102,709? And it's the 13th of May entry at 12:47. And it may be page 219, but I'll be corrected if I'm wrong. 13th of May, 12:47. Oh, yes, there we are. Thank you very much. There's a reference to Jamie Njoku Goodwin.
Yes.
Is he one of your advisors, or is he?
Yes, he was my media advisor at the time. He's now director of strategy in Number 10.
Matt, we might have some issues with you telling the Prime Minister we locked down care homes before the rest of the country. So this is your advisor telling you that there may be a need to correct, either directly or indirectly, an impression seemingly given by you in your communications with the Prime Minister. And the rest of the page and the next 2 pages deal with your debate about whether there was a justification for using those words and how it might be justified retrospectively. What was that debate about? In what way did the Prime Minister believe that, or your aide believe that by saying we locked down the care homes, you might not have been entirely accurate?
Well, it depends on how you define lockdown.
If you just tell us the debate. In what way do you say you didn't say anything misleading, and in what way was it being suggested against you that you had?
Well, it depends on whether you define the actions that were taken in the publication on the 13th of March, that guidance, as lockdown or not. Unless we,
so it was in the debate. It was in the
detail.
Context of the 13th of March measures.
Yes, because the critique being put at the time was that we took action to protect people in care homes later than locking down the rest of the country, and that was not true because we took action on the 13th of March with respect to care homes. Whether that action was strong enough or not to call it lockdown, for instance, it included visitor restrictions, I think, that's the point of debate. I think the answer
in fact,
is
Mr. Njoku Goodwin sets out at the bottom of the page in his WhatsApp what the measures were from the 13th of March. Those are the 13th of March measures, aren't they? To minimise the risk of transmission, care home providers are advised to review their visiting policy by asking no one to visit who has suspected COVID-19 or is generally unwell, and by emphasising good hand hygiene for visitors. Contractors should be kept to a minimum. The review should consider the well-being of residents. In no universe, Mr. Hancock, could those measures possibly be described as locking down the care homes.
I think that's what Jamie was trying to tell me.
All right, thank you. Another hugely, it became a very divisive issue again, was the moving of personnel between care homes.
Yes.
Your statement makes plain that you became aware of initial evidence showing that the movement of staff between care homes was the main source of transmission.
Yeah.
And I pause there simply to say, I don't intend to ask you any questions, and I would be grateful if you don't answer or try to give an answer about the degree to which the discharge of patients from hospital contributed to infections in the care homes as opposed to the movement of staff. That's for another time. But you became aware of evidence saying that the movement of staff was the main source of transmission.
Yes.
Sir Patrick Vallance has, through his evening notes, said that, or suggested that, he had been telling you for some time before that date, before the 11th of May, that the movement of persons between care homes was a significant issue. And he says, we raised it in February, and he'd been told by you that the movement of care homes wasn't going to be stopped because it was essential for that sector. Would you just briefly say whether or not you accept the suggestion that Sir Patrick Vallance had been trying to raise the issue with you before but had made no progress, or do you deny that suggestion that you were late to this particular issue and only moved belatedly?
The challenge here is that there was a balance between two very difficult problems, and many problems during the pandemic, many decisions were about balancing two unpalatable outcomes. Early in the pandemic, we were acutely aware of care homes in other countries where, in particular, there was an example in Spain that was very vivid in my memory, where there hadn't been enough staff. In that case, there were no staff and the residents had died. Sadly, in care homes, people are both most vulnerable to the virus and most in need of human interaction for their well-being and ultimately to live day to day. So we were very, very worried about not having enough staff to keep people alive, at the same time as being very worried about the transmission of the virus. Now, of course, it comes down to the assumption you make about asymptomatic transmission, and it comes down to the balance between these two awful considerations. By April, when there was more, when we had more time, and the care sector had time to get its to deal with the logistical problems of restricting staff movement, we then took action, which I think we announced in the middle of May. So my explanation for why Patrick might feel that way is that there is a scientific argument on the one hand, and there is an operational argument on the other, and some of his greatest frustrations were when the scientific requirement and the operational constraints were in conflict with each other, as they were in this case.
Forgive me, the very difficult conundrum faced by government is obvious. I wasn't asking about that. I was asking you whether there is any truth to the suggestion that Sir Patrick Vallance had asked you and had told you that the issue of moving people between care homes was important, and that you had rejected that as an issue. He says, I got told off. And that you only belatedly appreciated that there was a very real problem. Is that true or not?
That is not correct. It's not a fair reflection of my position. Firstly, I wouldn't deign to tell off Patrick Vallance, who is a very eminent scientist and businessman. Also, my challenge at the time as Secretary of State, indeed our challenge both as a department and with the care sector, who we discussed these matters with, was this balance between the absolute need to have staff and the imperative to reduce transmission, which was carried by staff. And these two difficult considerations were in conflict. It is not reasonable to just take one side of that argument. You have to take both into account.
Moving on, a couple of discrete issues, please. In your witness statement at paragraph 393, you refer to, in the context of the devolved administrations, to difficulties encountered by the United Kingdom government associated with the Scottish government taking, I'll summarise it in this way, different positions presentationally or
yes,
politically, notwithstanding a common clinical position.
Yes.
So taking a presentational political angle on matters which were understood to be common ground clinically.
Yes.
To what is that a reference?
Well, we worked very well together at Health Minister, Health Secretary level, and there's evidence of that in the WhatsApps. I know that at CMO level they worked very well together, and Chris Whitty has testified to that. The challenge was that when decisions went up from our level to First Minister and Prime Ministerial level, there would sometimes be an agreement on what to do, but someone would go ahead and announce it beforehand, causing confusion, or a choice to do something which was substantively the same but presentationally different or marginally different, which I thought in some cases was for the sake of presentation. My starting point was the scientific point, which is that we live on an island or a set of islands, and the virus does not recognise administrative boundaries, even ones that are centuries old, like the Scottish and Welsh borders. And it is necessary to take decisions across the whole island that are consistent. And there was also obviously a communications challenge with the public. So I found it unfortunate that sometimes, not all the time by any stretch, but sometimes when decisions went up, in particular in Scotland, and in particular at First Minister level, there would then be a political angle or presentational angle put on a decision based on the same science. It was frustrating.
Moving now to the summer of 2020, without going into the detail of the plan to rebuild or the exit from the first national lockdown, it's plain, Mr. Hancock, that there was a vigorous debate about the speed at which the country should come out of the measures, and a debate about the speed at which the particular phases of the roadmap should be proceeded through.
Yeah.
Your statement suggests that you had significant concerns about whether or not step 3 of the roadmap went too far, because it was obvious that cases were rising again. And you also questioned the tone and ambition of government publications, in particular one of the chapters of the plan to rebuild.
Can you remind me of the date of step 3?
It's phase 3. I don't think I can assist on the particular date of that phase. It matters not, because it's obvious it was in May that the
cases started rising mid-July. That's when I really started worrying.
Yes, but your statement says step 3 went too far as cases began rising again. And
I see. Yes.
You also
subsequently,
in July later expressed concern to the Prime Minister about the speed of release. Yes. I don't want to trouble you with the detail, but in this general debate about caution against speed of release,
yes,
you were for caution.
Yes.
To what extent were your concerns heard and reflected in the government's position thereafter?
Well, they were heard and they were reflected, I guess, in as much as it might have been more. There might have been more opening had I not made these arguments. My entire strategy at this point was to try to keep R below 1. I thought that it was I was completely alongside Chris Whitty during this period on this strategy, which was summer is the best time to release. If R goes a bit above 1 over the summer, not the end of the world so long as cases are very low, but then we'll have to take action in the early autumn to get it down again. But the critical thing is to keep it under control. And in this period, I articulated what I regarded as the government strategy, which was we suppress the virus until a vaccine can make us safe. Now, after articulating that a few times, I then got asked by Number 10 not to say it because we didn't know we'd get a vaccine. But I was confident by this point that we would get one. And anyway, I couldn't see any other way through this without far too many deaths.
When were you asked by Number 10 not to say it?
I can't remember. It was in a press conference. We should be able to find the paperwork if we dig further for it.
Just assist us roughly.
It will have been in a press conference in July or August.
Your statement says in terms that you believe that step 3 of the roadmap went too far, which tends to suggest that your concerns were not reflected in the outcome of that roadmap because step 3 had been promulgated. You thought they went too far, but it couldn't be reversed.
But certainly not fully reflected. But as throughout the autumn, the Prime Minister balanced economic and health considerations, and I made the health argument as well as I could. And this was an early precursor to the much more involved debates over September and October.
Do you recall ONS data being released on the 29th of July?
Yes, I remember that the number of cases bottomed out on the 13th of July, and I remember the ONS, which came out a little bit later but was more robust. The ONS survey would come out shortly after that.
The ONS data of that date show, according to your statement, and it is, of course, right, that cases had risen, and to use your word, dramatically.
Yes, from a very low base, but yes.
Did you know in advance of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme?
No, that was announced not ahead of its announcement on the 8th of July.
No.
In fact, cases were still falling at that point.
Did you raise your concern when the scheme was announced, and of course it was announced in advance of the beginning of August and meant to take effect on
3rd of August, I think.
Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays for those 4 weeks of August.
I didn't know about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme until the cabinet meeting on the morning of its announcement, and it was one of a package of loosenings. We were doing a number of things to bring back a bit of freedom over the summer.
As the Secretary of State for Health, had you been told and had you been asked for your view, what would you have said?
I don't know.
Well, Mr. Hancock, you've told the inquiry that there is in this debate between caution and allowing release, and it's a difficult debate, a public health view, which you as the Secretary of State are plainly on the side of caution.
Yes.
Because that's your job.
What mattered in the opening then was that there wasn't overall too much. And in the end, there was overall too much. Which individual items of opening you did or didn't do is second order compared to the overall amount of openings. I was at the same time campaigning internally to get funding so that those who tested positive would isolate, which we eventually got put in place in September. And I thought that was the most important use of money.
Did you express serious reservations about the scheme once you became aware of it, given your well-known position as Secretary of State for Health on the balance between release and positive promotion of eating out and caution?
Once it was announced, it was a done deal that it was government policy. I expressed caution and argued very strongly against its extension at the end of August, and I don't think its extension was ever seriously in prospect.
So you did argue very strongly against it, did you?
I argued that it shouldn't be extended.
It was a serious issue, though, was it not, in terms of the possible, and I'm not going to go into debate about what the impact actually was in terms of prevalence, but in terms of at least the perception in intervention areas, it was a serious problem.
In intervention areas, it was unhelpful that the state should be subsidising people to go out at the same time as asking people to be more cautious.
It was serious.
Well, what I'd say is that I think there has been undue focus on this one item. And where the then Chancellor is absolutely right in his statement is he argues that this was not the sole cause of the second wave.
What matters is I've deliberately not asked you.
What matters was the overall, what Chris Whitty at the time called the R budget, the overall set of measures. My goal was to keep R below 1. If keeping R below 1 with a tighter set of measures elsewhere, but with this scheme in place, if that could have kept R below 1, I would have been happy with it. And if within the debate and negotiation, if it was easier to keep the Chancellor in a good place on other measures that were necessary in order to keep R below 1 as a whole, then tactically that would be something I'd be happy with. What matters here is the overall budget and keeping R below 1. In the end, that loosening was too much. Eat Out to Help Out was just one of many measures, and in effect, with hindsight, you can go through and you can look at 10 measures and say we, in the end, could have afforded 7 of these. And whether Eat Out to Help Out is on that list or not is a moot point. That was the attitude that I took. I wanted to keep R below 1.
129458 is a WhatsApp from you to Simon Case. Just want to let you know directly, we've had lots of feedback that Eat Out to Help Out is causing problems in our intervention areas. I've kept it out of the news, but it's serious. This is you, Mr. Hancock.
Yes.
Have you told Rishi? And then Mr. Case says again, I don't think he can afford to extend it. And then you, yes, we've told Treasury. We've been protecting them in the comms, and thankfully it hasn't bubbled up.
Yes.
So the position you took was indeed that it was serious, that's your word,
Yes.
that you told the Treasury,
Yes.
but whilst you did so, you protected the Treasury in the news, you concealed your concerns about the seriousness of the impact of this scheme, and you expressed thanks, gratitude, it hadn't come to light.
That's because I abide by collective responsibility. And I was being encouraged by various journalists who would presume that I was against it to criticise the then Chancellor. But I believe that government is a team effort. And so I didn't want that to become a row in public. I mean, you can see during the whole pandemic the corrosive effect of leaks. I was not part of that, and I don't appreciate government by leak, and hence I abided by collective responsibility on and off the record. That's what I'm saying there.
As we are all aware, in the autumn, rates continued to go up, prevalence went up. There was a rule of 6 introduced. In the context of this debate between relaxation, promoting the economy, and caution and keeping R below 1, did the Prime Minister take a consistent approach to one or the other sides of that argument?
I think it's fair to say that the Prime Minister felt strongly the arguments for the protection of health and the arguments for liberty and the protection of the economy. My particular beef was that I didn't think there was a trade-off at all, and there wasn't. It wasn't an either-or. You couldn't choose between either. And my intense frustration was that economists at the Treasury and elsewhere couldn't see that although you could protect the economy by not locking down this week or next week, the consequence, the second round consequence of that, would be a firmer, more economically damaging lockdown in the future. And as a trained economist and knowing some of them, the second round impact of a decision is what economics is all about. And I couldn't get them to see, it was deeply frustrating, that it was against the economic interest as well as against the health interest to avoid the action that was necessary. The Prime Minister saw it as both, and he felt very keenly the instincts on both sides.
In your book, for the 26th of August, it purports to be a diary entry, but we now know that these are not diary entries.
Not now, no. I was clear when I published it.
For all our best efforts to avoid chaotic lurching, the Prime Minister has veered off. Do you recall writing that in your book?
I do, and I remember that period.
Yes. So the answer to the question I put, which is, did the Prime Minister take a consistent line, is not that he was conscious of the debate, both sides, but that you used your efforts as well as the efforts of others to avoid chaotic lurching on his part. And the clear impression you give in your own book, Mr. Hancock, is that yet again he had veered off.
What period are we talking about?
26th of August.
So late August was frustrating because in July, the Prime Minister had been extremely concerned that there was a second wave, and it's reflected in the various communications, and then came back from holiday and was much more concerned with not locking down, and I found that a problem.
Mr. Hancock, they're your words. Chaotic lurching. That's not entirely similar to suggesting that he was reasonably and sensibly taking a different view in light of new information or scientific advice. Is it?
There are different degrees of diplomacy with which you can give an answer to the same question.
In September, as you've indicated and as your statement makes plain, that the data shows that infection rates were going up and in a very broad sense, the country was faced with a scenario similar to that faced at the end of February. That's what you suggest in your statement.
Yeah. Actually, case rates were higher than at the end of February.
Yeah, well, that is your assessment. You say similar to that faced at the end of February. What, in general terms, as the Secretary of State, was your position in September? Were you arguing for, at that early stage, circuit breaker, which is a short lockdown, if you like, I suppose, or a longer national lockdown, or were you calling for the better implementation of local restrictions, or perhaps beefed up rules of six or whatever?
Well,
what was your position, General?
My position was to argue first and foremost for tougher local lockdowns and the tiers system with a stronger top tier. And I first put that forward at the end of August to my own team. We worked it up and took it to a COVID-0 in the middle of September. And it was very frustrating that it took me a month to get that policy in place. Even more frustrating was that the top tier was not enough to get R below 1, and therefore not effective for the task. That was deeply frustrating. The second thing was, where national measures like the rule of six were proposed, I was an enthusiastic supporter of them.
And the inquiry asks, of course, and without getting into the detail, because SPI-MO on the 16th of September mooted a planned circuit breaker around the October.
Sorry, I didn't answer on circuit breaker. Yeah,
exactly, on the October half term. And on the 17th of September, SAGE recommends a circuit breaker.
Yeah.
And then you'll recall that the COVID task force on the 19th of September, I'm sure you'll recall this, put forward to the Prime Minister a number of different measures, Package A, Package B, Package C, and a circuit breaker.
Yeah.
Where were you between the 17th and the 20th of September on the circuit breaker proposition?
I was in favour of tougher measures that could get R below 1, especially in the areas where intervention was most needed because cases were highest. I was not convinced by the circuit breaker proposal on two grounds. The first is it's effectively just a short lockdown, and if you put it in for 2 weeks, I could see why, in theory, if for 2 weeks no human would come into contact with any other human, then the case numbers would drop dramatically. But in the real world, that isn't how life works. For instance, in hospitals, in care homes, people have to interact. And secondly, the political impact of repeat circuit breakers would have been to lose the confidence of those who we needed to have on board to make it happen. And I thought that therefore a circuit breaker was not the best approach because basically rates would just shoot up afterwards. That is what happened when they tried one in Wales. I was more strongly in favour. The thing I wanted to see was action to keep R below 1. And the way that I thought that was best organised was a degree of national action and then the tiers system, making sure you could get the pandemic under control where it was most virulent. That was my view at the time. I can go through with hindsight what I now think of it.
Well, before you look at the hindsight angle, you say in your statement there were no excuses second time round.
Yeah.
That's to say, in relation to the second lockdown.
Yeah.
Case numbers rose from mid-July 2020.
Yeah.
And it was clear, so this isn't hindsight, this is reality.
Yeah.
It was clear that a second wave was coming from late August.
Indeed, I said so on the record.
I began to call for measures to suppress,
Yes.
not mitigate, but suppress the virus in early September.
Yes.
The only possible strategy was to suppress the virus.
Until a vaccine came good.
I regret I was unable to win that argument.
Yes.
Why did you not lend your support to the scientific advice, which was to the effect that a circuit breaker in September was required?
Well, that wasn't the unanimous scientific advice. Because
Mr. Hancock, Sage recommended a circuit breaker on the 17th of September.
if I can finish my sentence, because I discussed it with the chief medical officer at the time, and his view was subtly different to Sage's. He thought we needed to put in the restrictions necessary to get R below 1 in a way that would hold consistently through the winter. And I thought that was a better proposition. Now, with hindsight, should I have teamed up with the formal Sage conclusions, etc.? Well, it would have been better to have something rather than nothing, but my concern with a circuit breaker, even with hindsight, is that coming in and out of lockdown is not sustainable. It is not fair on the public, and it would have lost support amongst legislators, and I don't think it would have worked. With hindsight, the tiers system didn't work because where we did put it didn't work firstly because I wasn't allowed to have a top tier that was strong enough. But even if we had, people just moved. You know, we came up with the tiers system to make sure that people in areas of low prevalence didn't get the full whack of lockdown measures. And it is because I cared about places like Herefordshire and Cornwall that hardly had any cases. And it seemed unfair that they should be locked down because other places had higher prevalence. But the truth is, people travelled and the spread came out. And Patrick Vallance was right about his critique of tiers in his evidence. So I would not recommend tiers for the
Can I interrupt
future.
to say we're going to deal with tiers in the morning.
Okay.
On this issue of why you didn't endorse as the Secretary of State for Health, the person whom, by your own words, was bound to take the public health position.
Because it wouldn't have worked in practice, and when it was tried in Wales, it didn't work. What we needed was a consistent lockdown for the winter that would have kept R below 1.
On the 17th of September, you couldn't have known that the lockdown in Wales wouldn't have worked. It hadn't been put into place. And weren't you meant to be following the science?
No, I was meant to be guided by the science. That was my whole approach. Guided by the science, but if I thought, as I thought on this, that it wouldn't work, then I would take another decision. And anyway, in discussions with the chief medical officer, who was my principal clinical advisor, we thought, or at least he thought it was reasonably arguable, that a single consistent policy to keep R below 1 would have been better. I just don't think in out would have worked over the winter.
Milady,
is that where you'd like to finish the evening?
Please.
Well, you've had a very long day, Mr. I'm sorry we can't finish you today, but I think you were warned that we'd have to ask you to come back tomorrow. There are quite a few questions from core participants, so as soon as Mr. Keith is concerned, we'll start those. We will definitely conclude your evidence before I break for lunch.
I'm available as long as you need me.
Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.